Hey everyone, Sean Frangella here with a new After Effects tutorial about my top 5 After Effects expressions. So inside of After Effects, one of the most powerful things we can do is add expressions on top of keyframes to really make things easier, automate some things, and connect layers in ways that wouldn't be possible with just keyframes. But expressions can be a little daunting at first, so I wanted to put together this top 5 list of ones that I use pretty often to make it a little more approachable and show what you can do by just getting some basics down of how to work with expressions and some of the most commonly used ones. So before getting started with the list, let me just take a moment to explain what expressions are and what you can do with them from a fundamental perspective. So how expressions work is anywhere in After Effects that there's a stopwatch, which is pretty often and everywhere. Instead of clicking to make a keyframe, we can option click and then type in expressions, which are little scripts within After Effects. We could type things in, or we can click this little arrow and get this huge list of expressions, which is every expression within After Effects. And we can also pick whip and connect parameters, as well as use basic arithmetic to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. So what that means, as an example, is I have a really basic animation of just a circle growing and scaling. Now, say I wanted other objects to be doing the same thing or be doing it based on division or multiplication. I'm just going to duplicate this circle layer and press U and just delete all keyframes. So I have a circle that's not doing anything floating around here. What I could do with expressions is on this circle, instead of copying and pasting these keyframes and having to worry about updating multiple sets of keyframes, I can option click, pick whip the scale of this property to the scale of the other circle, and it's going to write out an expression to connect these, and then I can click off or press enter. And now through expressions, these two are connected. But you can also add arithmetic to this, so we could have this whole expression that says connect this scale, and at the end we could add plus, minus, asterisk for multiply, or slash for divide. So we could say multiplied by 8, for example, and it's going to take the scale of this object and always multiply it by 8. So this is useful because if I make updates to the original one, say it only animates from 0 to 50, it's going to update there, and I don't have to update multiple things. And I could do the same thing with division, so I'll make another copy, pull it over here. And a great shortcut now that we're getting expressions is the letter E. So U will show all keyframes. E will show all expressions if you tap it a couple times. So I have the second circle with that same expression, and instead of multiplied, let's put divided by. And now I have one that's half the size. So again, if I just duplicated the original one, you would see all keyframes, and then connect that to the scale of the original one with option click and then pick whip at the scale and do the same thing divided by 2. Now I have one animating inside of itself, which is always 50% the scale. So you can connect stuff, but you can also use math to add, subtract, multiply, divide, which can be really powerful and will be really helpful once we get started with a few more. All right, so now that we got the basic idea down, let's start talking about our list. So top 5 expressions. Number 1 is the wiggle expression. So what this does, if I take any property, I can type in, after I option click, lowercase wiggle, left parenthesis, a number, comma, a number, right parenthesis, and this represents times per second, so amplitude, and units over here, so magnitude. And what this will do is wiggle the original property setting above and below this many times per second, so say it's 2, comma, this many units. So as a quick example, I have below those circles 2 solids, one with a color and one with a gradient and a circle mask to create this vignette. So if I just wanted these properties to animate in the background and kind of scale without having to have keyframes, what I could do is put a wiggle expression on expansion if we just wanted it to be animating like this endlessly. So what we can do is option click. I'm going to type wiggle, left parenthesis, 4 as an example. So 4 times a second, comma, units. So 100, right parenthesis. And 4 times a second, it's going to animate above and below the original value of 0, 100 units. So if I scrub through, you can see that the text is now red and it's animating back and forth 4 times a second. And why expressions is so useful is because rather than adding keyframes and changing it, we can just change these numbers. So if it was too fast, we could go 2 times a second. And if we wanted more, we could just type in 200 as an example. And this applies to every parameter. So as another example, we'll just get these circles out of here and just move them out of the way a bit for now, but we'll leave them on the composition because it looks a little interesting and it'll be useful background animation. So as another example, say I had text that was 3D, so I'm gonna type the word motion, make it white. I'll go with something like Gotham bold, because that's a good motion graphics font, and center that in my composition, and I'll just get this circle out of the way and scale this up a bit. Now say that this was 3D text down here, and then when I press R for rotation, I have 3 rotation values. Now if I wanted this to just be kind of randomly rotating on Y, I can do that same thing. Option click, wiggle, left parentheses, time per second, comma, units. And since this is rotation, it's going to do degrees because that's the units that it's going to see. So if I type in 60 as an example, twice a second, it's going to randomly rotate from the original point of 0 a maximum of 60 degrees in either direction. So you can get some really cool animation by adding the wiggle expression. Now, what it's doing is looking at each unit. So there are some very specific instances on things like position or scale where there's multiple. So I'll hide this text for now and say that I had another circle, and I'll just move this to the center and delete all the keyframes because I don't want anything on it right now, and scale it back up. Now say I wanted the scale of this to wiggle, so I option click wiggle 2, 200, so it wiggles the scale 200%. If I play, it's actually doing these separately, and that's probably not what I want unless I wanted this kind of weird animation. So to do this and constrain these, there's a couple expressions that go a little farther beyond the wiggle that I like to use, which I have copied here. So if we want to wiggle scale uniformly, we do a little bit of a different one, but I can copy that from my document. And what we need to do is have this little extra expression that sets a variable called wiggle and then seeds it into them the same. So now if I have this one, W equals wiggle, and then these will be my units, and it's gonna seed them exactly the same, so they're both defined as 0. Now if I use that and then just change the numbers, it's going to scale that uniformly. And this also applies to position. So say I wiggled the position 4 times a second, comma 300, so 300 pixels. It's just gonna kind of float around. But if I wanted to constrain it to X or Y, there's another one I have over here which works great, which is a little further. And if I copy paste this in here and take a look at this, there's one that we can write out that's defining X, Y, and W as transform position, transform Y position, and then that same wiggle expression. So 4 times a second, it's going to go 400. So then it would go just left and right. And if I wanted to switch this one, I could just cut this and write X and change the order. And now it's going to go up and down. And if you're wondering how to remember these, well, I have this document that I typed all these out on that I just like to copy and paste. And if you want to grab this, head on over to the Facebook page at facebook.com/Vital and send me a message, and I will send you this document because it's a really useful little resource for these specific ones where the wiggles get a little more interesting. So wiggle is very useful. Let's continue on. Number 2, time. So what we can do as an expression to write out is if I, again, option click, say opacity. If I type in the word time, all lowercase, what this one will do is take the value that the expression is on and link it to the number of seconds where the playhead currently is in my composition. So what this means is if I have opacity, it's going to start at 0, and then when it gets to 1 second, it's going to be 1, 2 seconds, 2. Same idea if I did rotation and just type time and say I offset this anchor point, it's going to at 1 second be 1 degree, 2 seconds, 2 degrees. Now, this seems kind of useless at the beginning, but why this is useful is we can add multiplication to this, so we can have time, say for rotation, and then instead of 1 degree a second, say time times 30, then it's going to go 30 degrees every second. And now if we play, it's going to continue to rotate and now go 30 degrees every second. So why this one can be really useful is because it's really good for automating animation where you just want it to continuously go. So this would just endlessly rotate. And it's really useful for effects that have a degrees meter. So say as an example, on top of this, I'll add a new adjustment layer and I'll put in cell pattern as an example, which creates this kind of organic pattern. Any effect that has a meter like this where it's evolution, rather than having keyframes, we can option click and then type in time multiplied by a number. So let's say 300. So where the playhead is times 300. And then if I play, it's just going to animate this. And this makes it a lot easier than using keyframes, because instead of changing keyframes, if we want this to be faster, we can just increase the number. So time times 500, it'll go much faster. And then say if I just put this on a blending mode like add or overlay, now I have this animation in the background that's just going on time. And maybe I'll take the opacity of that down a bit, or even wiggle the opacity. Let's say twice a second, 25 units from 75. So it's going to take the original value. And now I have this animating background that's evolving over time, that's animating on opacity in and out. And there's some other useful ones that also have this evolution, just as another example. If on top of everything I add another adjustment layer, and then I'll add hue saturation, and I check on colorize, this is going to colorize everything below it. And if I turn up saturation, it's going to get a lot more saturated. And this has the same sort of rotation meter, so if I cycled through these, it's going to evolve the color over time. So rather than keyframes for this hue, I could option click and put time times 30. And now it's going to just endlessly cycle through these colors. So this is a really useful one, again, whenever you have these rotation, that you can just have it endlessly animating over time without having to worry about keyframes. All right, let's keep going. Number 3, loop out. Now in my composition, hide that center circle and just bring back up those ones that had the keyframes. So I had this original circle that has 3 keyframes that's scaling up and down that I can see right here. So it scales up from 0 to 100 to 0, but it's only 3 keyframes, so it stops. And what we can do with loop out is, instead of copying and pasting a bunch of keyframes, if we just wanted keyframe animation to go continuously, if we already have keyframes, we can option click, type loop uppercase O out, left parentheses, right parentheses. And what this is going to do is add the expression on top of the keyframes and loop those keyframes. So it is important to note that expressions happen after our keyframes. So it's going to do our keyframe or the changes we've made in our parameters and then add expressions. So now I can have these looping with only 3 keyframes, and the other ones are linked to it using expressions. And this is useful because it can keep going, as well as if I wanted this whole thing to be faster or shorter, it's going to pick up on those 3 keyframes, and I only have to worry about those 3, and it's going to loop whatever that whole animation is. So loop out can be useful for automating looping animation, as well as one little trick with looping an entire composition or footage. So we have this whole animation. Say that this was just a 3-second animation, so I'll do Command K, and I'm just going to change this to 3 seconds. What we can do is, if we wanted to loop this whole thing, is I'm going to take all of this and I'll pre-compose it. So right click, pre-compose, or a Shift Command C, and I'll call this main graphics and move all. So now I have this pre-comp that's main graphics within my main container composition, and this original container I'll make 20 seconds. So now if I zoom out of my timeline, I have one little clip. Say I wanted to loop this whole clip. What I could do is add timer mapping, right click, time, enable timer mapping. And that's gonna give me keyframes for that point in time. And I can drag this out. And this is for speeding up and slowing down time. But what we can do is, since this gives us keyframes to start with for the beginning and end, I could loop these. So if I option click, loop out, this is now going to loop this whole animation. And one little point that's really important to point out is you can see it kind of trips up. It's looping this footage that is 29.97 frame rate. And when you're ever doing this sort of thing, you really want this to be at a whole number. So this would be an instance that it's good to go to 30. And I'll go into my main graphics and set this to 30. And just to show that this is working, let's assume this is a clip that fades in and fades out on white. So I'll do layer, new solid, call it fade, make it white, and say that this fades in at the beginning over 3 frames. And I'll duplicate that, and then it fades out. So I'll just press U and grab those and right click, keyframe assistant, time reverse. So I have at the beginning, fades in from white and then fades out to white. So since I adjusted the frame rates to a whole number 30, now if I go back and just reset this, I'll turn off timer mapping. So I have my original clip, fades in from white, fades out to white. If I again right click, time, enable timer mapping, loop out, left parenthesis, right parenthesis. Now, since in my pre-comp, this fade in and fade out is sitting exactly on frame 0 and frame 90 at the end of 3 seconds, it's going to fade in, fade out, and you'll see once it renders this once, it's going to play really quickly because it only has to render that information. So this can be a really useful way to loop pre-comps, loop footage, as well as if you're thinking about working in 3D, looping 3D clips and only having to render out a couple of the original frames and then loop the comp in After Effects. So loop out can be useful for looping keyframes, but also entire footage. All right, number 4, seed random. So one thing you might have noticed in my composition that I've been working in is I have all these wiggle expressions. If I press E, and anytime I add a new layer, so I'll just add a null for the sake of conversation, everything suddenly changes. So again, this text was wiggling on rotation, and I added any new layer or even move it in the layer stack, and things get thrown off and it looks like the values changed. And I'll bring back that center circle that I had on that custom wiggle expression to constrain the scale evenly and maybe change that color so it doesn't look so conflicting with the background. And anyway, this one is on wiggle also, so it's scaling the whole time. And same idea, if I move anything around, suddenly the wiggle expressions seem different. And this could be a real problem and a real annoyance if you don't know why it's happening. So what's actually happening is, since this wiggle expression is random, the randomness has to come from somewhere, and how it's picking that is based on the layer number in the stack. So what that means is how it's actually seeding that randomness of the wiggle is saying create a random value based on, in this case, layer 11. And if it was at layer position 1, it's going to base that on position 1. So you can see everything kind of switches. And this can be a real problem because if you're adding new layers and moving things around, that is always going to be shifting. So what we can do with seed random is, above any wiggle expression, if I type in seed random with a capital R, left parentheses, a number, so say 0, right parentheses, and then drop that second line with the wiggle down. What this is going to do is say, always lock this random seed that you're picking to layer 0, which would be the first one if we're starting, because it will start at 0, and then apply the wiggle expression. So this way, no matter where this layer sits, it's going to always pick the randomness of the wiggle expression on position 0. So this is a good one to add wherever you have a wiggle expression. So I'll just select this and copy, press E, and then paste above our wiggle expression. And That way, if you have it above every wiggle expression, it's not going to shift if you move it around in the stack. So if I paste that above any of my wiggle expressions, and now if I move this word motion, it's not shifting around and recalculating how to seed that wiggle. And this can also be useful for changing the randomness, even if you weren't moving the layered motion. Again, how it's picking it is saying 0 is the first layer, 1 is the second layer, so this number represents where it hypothetically is in the stack. But say I had this word motion twisting, and I like the idea of it, but I just want to see kind of a different one, or say I don't want it to start exactly on this frame. What I could do is change that seed random value, and I'm going to get different animation because it's assuming it's a different number in the stack. So it's a good way to switch up the randomness, or say if you had circles animating, but they kind of get in front of the camera or a word, you can change the seed random value and get new animation. And finally, number 5, math.round. So as I mentioned, we could link any parameter to another parameter, and this is really useful for text. So I'm going to write text and just type in 00 as a placeholder. And how text works, if you twirl down text, there's actually a stopwatch for source text. And if you turn it on and off, it doesn't do anything. But why this is useful is because you can link expressions to it. As an example, I'll make a new circle at the top of my composition, and I'll make sure its center point is the center of the composition, and call this circle, and say that it's rotating. So I'll press R and type in time times 300. So this value is rotating around the composition. We can see that the value is going up. What we can do with text is link this to any value. So if I option click and pick whip this to rotation and press enter, this text is actually going to display what this rotation is. And since this is a whole number at every frame, it's always going to display fine. But say if I change it to something that's not going to come out at a whole number like 315, you can see that it's adding up all these extra decimal points, and I might not want that. And what we could do with math.round is put this expression inside of that. So I'll type at the beginning, capital M for math dot lowercase round, left parenthesis, and then at the end of this, right parenthesis. What this will do is round off this value, and it's going to snap the alignment to whatever my paragraph is. So if I want it right aligned, it's always going to right align center. Now, rotation isn't that big of a deal because it was always half degrees, but where this math.round and linking to is useful is, say if I wanted a counter and to kind of have more control over expressions, where we can really go in a whole other tutorial, is because of all this linking, there's actually some effects for expressions over here called expression controls. And one of them is a slider. So in this example, we made the source text equal this rotation, but we could actually have it be an empty shell that we point something to. And what I mean by that is, on any layer, if I drag this slider control, so I'll just put it on the text because it'll be easy to keep track of. And I could put this on a null, which I like to do sometimes, but this is fine for now. This slider control or any of these expression controls are all empty meters that look like the dials for After Effects effects, but they don't really do anything. And what these are useful for is because I can link text or values around and say, instead of source text equaling this rotation, source text, option click, and pick whip it equals this slider control. And why this is useful is now I can animate this slider control like I could any other effect in After Effects. So option click on the slider control. At the beginning, I have a keyframe that's 0, and let's say at 1 second, it goes up to 100. So now if I play, it's going to be calculating this huge decimal point number. And again, that's probably not what I want. So again, this source text is saying this text doesn't equal those original values. It equals this slider that's animating from 0 to 100, but it's this huge decimal point. So I can put inside of that math.round, left parentheses, and then at the end, right parentheses, and now it's going to round that to a whole number. So math.round is really useful when you start to get into slider controls and pointing text values to numbers, but getting the whole numbers. And these slider controls, on that note, can be incredibly useful because you can control wiggles with them. You could grab a wiggle expression and say instead of this 2, this wiggle could equal a slider, and we could have multiple sliders, and then the amount of wiggle will equal those. And sliders and effects controls are a whole other topic, and you can do some really powerful things with them. So this has been Sean Frangella going over my top 5 After Effects expressions and some really cool stuff you can do with expressions to automate animation, make your life a hell of a lot easier, and connect and control layers in After Effects in really cool and creative ways. As always, thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe on youtube.com/Sean Frangella, as well as check out the Facebook page at facebook.com/Vital, and hit me up on Twitter if you want to ask questions, request tutorials, and interact on the social networks. As always, thanks for watching, and I will see you at the next video.